be here with us. So yeah, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. This conversation is, I think it came up as an opportunity to explore the synergy between Atelier and Envisioning, were both sort of very present at the Futures Literacy Summit. So we decided to put together this quick conversation to talk about this project we put together a little while ago, and use the opportunity to sort of launch it and host the conversation on the implications of privacy. The reason is we created this choose your own adventure style narrative meant to help people see some of the implications that technology has on their privacy. And while we can show it on screen, it's truly meant to be a personal experience. So I might just start by showing it, and we can use this as a let's start with this, and then we can jump into the conversation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
Let's do it.
So the URL is in the chat for those wanting to check it out, and it's also on the invite. But what we've done is we created this non-linear narrative that is meant to help showcase how technologies affect, or how our technological choices affect, well, our reality, but also like how technology has privacy implications, and the choices we make end up affecting that. So what we did is we crafted this narrative where you're the one in charge as a reader, and you make choices throughout the narrative. So here you say you're going to download a piece of software, and you click through the terms and conditions, which are extensive and funny. And you then hopefully accept the TNC. And as you go through the narrative, new choices will unfold. And you make these choices based on where you want to see the narrative going. And after a handful of these, and you read it through, and it's all illustrated, and towards the end of this, you'll end up being presented by a radar, of which you've seen others by now probably, that reflects your choices. So the narrative itself takes between 5 and 15 minutes, depending on your choices. But towards the end, we'll sort of summarize or investigate the choices you made, and then produce a interactive radar that reflects your choices. So what you clicked through ends up affecting the radar itself. And Thiara can speak a little bit to the technologies, or to how your choices are reflected in sort of the polarities presented by the radar.
Sure.
Yeah.
So welcome everybody. My name is Thiara Cavadas. I'm the head of research and also partner at Envisioning. Michell, who just spoke, he's Envisioning CIO, and we have also John and Nadya, which are one of our biggest clients from Atelier. And well, Envisioning, what we basically do is that we look at the future through emerging technologies. So our role is basically to scout emerging technologies, analyze them, and see how they will be affecting industries in the future. We talk a lot with governments mainly, but also companies who are really interested on the future. And well, Joe and Nadia, they're not your average clients. They always keep pushing us to do different stuff. And one of the ways we map and scout technologies is through science fiction. So we really go through science fiction books, games, movies, and we map emerging technologies that are already there in their idea stage, and we capture them and see if they have a correlation to reality. We also do this with academic articles, media sources, patents, and other sources we also have to access in our database. And John came up with this idea that instead of us using science fiction only as a source, we could use science fiction as a way to demonstrate how these emerging technologies would unfold the future. So our idea was basically, first of all, to map emerging technologies that were related to privacy. And these emerging technologies, once we have mapped and we have analyzed them through their technology readiness level and through other metrics, we had the exercise of clustering these technologies and creating scenarios. And what we have seen is that each of these scenarios, they could be a dystopia or a utopia, for example. So the same technologies that create security and that create a way for us to be more safe in cities and well in society are the same technologies that could create huge privacy leaks and could really take control of our lives. So we have seen that all technologies, they have these uh, two sides of the coin, let's say. So they have not only a bad and a good side, but they have like multiple facets to them. So what we've done was basically to um, look at these technologies and see what these same technologies could create in terms of dystopias and utopias. And based on this symmetry, we have created the narrative using these emerging technologies. So all the technology you see on the Wheels project, which is this interactive tool that Michelle had just showcased, they are actually real technologies that are emerging. And according to your choices, the radar that you will see afterwards will is being automatically designed and personalized just to your choice. So that was our basic methodology process. So this is not only a tool that it's fun and nice to play, like a science fiction narrative, but it's actually a sci-fact narrative as well on how the future may unfold. So it was a really amazing exercise. We have worked with science fiction um, writers, and also our clients, Joe and Nadia, had a huge contribution on editing everything, and they were really part of the whole project. So I would love for give the microphone to Joe and Nadia to tell a little bit about their experience as well.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Thiara. So a quick introduction to L'Atelier. L'Atelier is a foresight business. We're a subsidiary of BNP Paribas Group, and we look at the next decade and emerging sociocultural and technological change. We do an awful lot of that work infused by data that we're monitoring and what we observe. And we've kind of long felt science fiction is a great way to craft nuance. I think with certain complex topics, and privacy is one of them, it is a very difficult thing for most people to comprehend the decisions that we make every day and the impact that it might have on our long-term capacity for autonomy. Because privacy is this subtle exchange between utility and autonomy, and we do it all the time. And to either extreme of that spectrum is problematic. And we wanted to really explore that. So that was the original impetus to talk about privacy in a nuanced way. It is not a simple case of having your data collected is all bad. It's not a case of being totally private is a good thing and having your data collected is a bad thing. It's not as simple as that. Sometimes it's really useful, and a simple example would be having a LinkedIn page makes it more likely that you're going to get job offers. So if you don't have a LinkedIn profile, you're probably less likely to get certain job offers. So there is an exchange there that you willingly go into, and it can be very, very useful for you. So that was what we wanted to play around with. And where's the balance? Where is the point at which you have sufficient autonomy that it doesn't begin to disintegrate or degrade things like democratic infrastructure as machines begin to make decisions on our behalf or guide us towards certain decisions? And at the same time, that we're not becoming isolated or ostracized from society by reaching for extreme privacy. And as privacy is more than just an individual effort, as it's a cumulative or group effort, there's going to be in the future more obligation that's foisted upon us by those who are around to accept certain levels of privacy access so that we can be part of a group. So that was the original impetus, the initial aspect of it. And I think what we really wanted to investigate was different ways that we could explore this. And that was where this idea of a choose your own adventure story comes to play. I think very simply, one thing that really sticks with me is that for the terms and conditions documents that the average person signs in the average year, it is the equivalent of an average year's work if you were to read them all. So clearly we don't read them all. It's just not feasible to do so unless that's our job. So with that in mind, we were like, okay, look, this is too big a topic to unpack easily or just to explore the technology, but by crafting a story, we could allow people to explore it in their own way. And they could see how the decisions that they make provide them with extraordinary opportunities and extraordinary challenges. And we can also show them how it can be a bit of a trap. It's difficult to get out of once you start down a certain path. So when we began to write this story, we're like, how do we bring it to life more? And that's where a lot of the illustrative work came into play as well. And I mean, I think I am still so enamored with the design work that was done for the project. I think it's such a beautiful way to express this. But Nadya, I suppose the two main kind of content producers for the narrative part of this, and you took a lot of, you'll see if anyone has done the project, we have three different streams. We have career and relationships and lifestyle. And they're three very different journeys that you go on. And Nadya was the primary producer for the lifestyle journey of this. So maybe it's worthwhile digging into that particular stream a little bit more.
Yeah, happy to. My role in the project was as a producer and a writer, particularly for that section. But I think one of the guiding stars for me in producing this was that obviously privacy is a topic that is on everybody's minds, but we mostly engage with it on an intellectual level, right? We read papers, we read about legislation, we read about technology. But I haven't seen many examples of anyone engaging with it on a more fundamental level. And that's why we thought that a piece of exploratory fiction is a really good way to do that. And for me, the main question that I was asking myself as you know, we were designing the scenarios was that every decision that we make about sharing our data incurs a debt into the future, right? And not only that, but there's a compounding effect to that. There are direct consequences of our decisions, there are second and third order consequences, and these scenarios, as we already mentioned, are not linear. And this makes it very difficult for any of us really to sufficiently comprehend and foresee the consequences of our decisions down the line, particularly as the technology that we use becomes more and more complex. That's why we created Will. We wanted to make those scenarios more tangible, more accessible, more comprehensible, more imaginable, by putting people in situations where they have to make ethical and existential, they have to make decisions about ethical and existential dilemmas, and start thinking about those consequences down the line. Particularly the lifestyle section, I think the two things that I really wanted to integrate into that is that pretty much every single part of that narrative, it's based on something that already exists. Small examples, in one case, for example, we talk about a technology that uses the axis between the gut and the brain to actually design drugs that address different diseases. That technology already exists. So pretty much everything there exists, but it really required us to think not only about what technology will be like 10, 15 years from now, but actually what the world will be like 10, 15 years from now, what the climate will be like, what our needs will be, how we're going to live, what housing will be like, what is the, issues like inequality, depression, stress, obsession with efficiency, particularly in the wellness business, which is growing as well, and it's pushing us to optimize how we live by giving our data. So these were the kind of the driving ideas behind actually designing the scenarios, particularly for the lifestyle one, but I think it applies to the other two as well.
Yeah, and it's super seductive. I think one of the things about this is that on both sides, so on the user side, all of these tools are designed to seduce us. And it's very, very effective at doing so. But there's also a seduction on the other side. So even for us, having done this, we get to see then the choices that people make when they're going through this narrative. And it's impossible not to be curious about that, to understand if there's different dynamics for different ages and different genders and different ethnic profiles or different nationalities. Like, these are all really curious things to look at. We began to see that certain decisions were made more frequently by certain types of people. That was really fascinating to see. It definitely kind of gave us some insight as well into the supplier side of this too, and how it's next to impossible not to use the data that's at your disposal to try and improve those experiences. So there's a seduction on both sides. and made us realize the inevitability sometimes of how these tools would be used. And once that data is there, it's difficult not to look and to make assumptions. So I think that was a really curious part of the seduction. But there's I mean, the number of people, two major takeaways that I had were that people were often really kind of shaken by the futures that they were faced with. And I think that we wrote some of the, if you think about it in positive or negative outcomes, as in positive being you accept and you say yes a lot, and negative being you don't accept and you say no. Well, the no tends to present this less than ideal situation where in the future autonomy presents a cost. But the yeses produce a situation where you yourself benefit, but often to society's detriment. So there's this payoff, which is if you make decisions that continue to improve your own utility, then you undermine society as everybody makes similar decisions. If you make decisions that are protect yourself, protect your own autonomy, you get ostracized. And I think that was a really interesting idea to explore. One other really curious thing from my side was observing who read the terms and conditions and who didn't. And I would think that, for every 500 people who read will or do will, there's maybe 1 or 2 people that will read the T's and C's. And because we always hear about it when anybody does read the T's and C's. For anybody who's on this call who's already done it, it's an interesting point to reflect on. Some of you may have actually read the T's and C's and seen that it's full of Easter eggs and kind of surprises that are in there. So we always hear back, and that was done intentionally. It was to prove the point that nobody reads the terms and conditions. So how are we supposed to know what we're really getting ourselves into and what that might mean in the future? So I'll stop there for a second and bring it back to Michelle.
I think, Michelle, would be nice to showcase a bit on, I have here a few screenshots on the process, because guys, it's like to create an interactive story is just so complicated. And even though we've tried to simplify as much as possible, it's just crazy to see, like, this is our, like, super code, let's say, of choices.
That's the branching narrative design.
So it's like really, really complicated to create an interactive storytelling. This is something that we have, was our first integration with this tool. We have done a couple since then, gladly. And, but it's just so complicated, because you really need to not only create a narrative, but you need to create multiples and ones that are interesting as well. So I guess that was the most difficult part, to make every single one of these branches really make sense.
Yeah, it has to be sort of internally cohesive, right? Because it can't break down depending on the choices you make.
Yeah. And
it seemed really simple when we started.
And there's 1,100 different paths through it, I think, isn't that? There's approximately 1,100 different ways you can navigate this, because you can actually leave and come back, or you can kind of move transversely a little bit as well in some spaces. So it was extremely complex to put something together that ended up being simple to use.
And the illustrations were as well was for us like a huge part of the process, because this project has been a little while, but from my memory, what I remember is that one of the designers created a whole set of stories. However, in his stories, like, the future didn't look much like the future that we as Envisioning would like to showcase. So, for example, all robots that were represented as women, they were all like super sexy with like gigantic boobs, and like we're like, no, this is not the future for us. Like, this is not how it's going to happen. Like, I want to be a little bit more gender neutral, and there was a lot of going back and forth with him to get the perfect match for us. And I'm really glad how it came up, really.
And I think that speaks to the responsibility one has in crafting future visions, especially because one thing is for say a designer who's been primed on certain visions of the future and sort of replicating that, the BIM bots and everything. But I think we tried stepping up our role and our responsibility, which is a form of futures literacy. I think it comes back to the theme of why we're here, which is to say, in crafting these visions of the future, one has to be responsible for the image that you project or that you create. And it's one of those things that they're hard to anticipate, right? Yeah, let's work with an illustrator and let's craft a story and see what happens. But then you realize this is not the future that we want to project. Then you have to take several steps back and sort of reconsider and change the path so that we end up so that future doesn't have more repercussions.
Yeah, because I think a lot of the time with futures literary stuff, a lot of the time it's meant to be a deliberate provocation. The work that we all do is we're not necessarily trying to predict the future. That's not the objective, although sometimes you might be successful in doing so. The objective is to articulate reasonable visions of the future at a particular time that could be possible based on the circumstances of today and the rate of change. And in doing that, there are infinite different possibilities, but we're trying to identify the ones that are either the most likely or the ones that are most provocative because there's change that's required. It's observational to say, look, this is something we should be concerned about. This is a real possibility if we don't stop moving down a certain path. I think that finding a balance between those two things as well, because creating pure dystopian visions is sometimes more easy to do and often sometimes not particularly useful. So trying to find a balance between, yeah, look, there is a dystopian potential here, but at the same time, this is totally reasonable to assume it's as a possibility based on the dynamics of the moment. And I think we're talking about privacy, and it's the curious thing about the future of anything, any conversation, any event that is the future of something. The future is the future. There is no future of one thing. It is not linear. It's not isolated. It's not individual. The future is the future. It's an infinite number of variables connecting in an infinite number of ways to create a future environment. And we talk about the future of one thing, we often suggest that it's linear in some way, and it's not. So the future of privacy, for instance, is not linear. It depends on the context of the time. And that means things like geopolitics. It means things like sociocultural change and atmosphere. It means things like economic inequality, and it means climate change and many other vectors. And all of these things will provide us with a set of conditions that will facilitate a particular outcome. When we looked at the future of privacy, we tried to consider the geopolitical conditions of this moment as well, and what that meant. And in some of the streams in the wealth and career stream, it does reference the clothing that people are wearing to try and get around some of the surveillance mechanisms. So that there's it's become styled to have haircuts that make visual recognition or facial recognition more difficult, that people have shoes that have different heights to disturb gait analysis. So these types of nuanced kind of introductions, we're not trying to say that the world will necessitate that, but I think it's quite clear that's totally reasonable at the moment, that with the level of surveillance in most cities at this point in time, that we will reach a point within the next decade or so that people begin to try and confound some of those systems through either their clothing or their styling in some way. And those sort of niche points are really interesting to explore because they help articulate these provocative or evocative moments of trajectory. So I'm wondering if the group that we have here, the attendees, if there are any questions. I'm really curious to find out as well, and I hope some people who have attended have done well or have been doing well while we've been talking. So if anybody has any questions,
I'm setting everyone up to be permitted to speak. So you're now allowed. So this is a webinar setting. So you can just unmute yourself and chime in.
So it would be great to hear some user comments on what people's experience was like doing well, if they found it disagreeable, if they found it, if they had an epiphany whilst doing it. But I think that's why we really did it, and that's why we made it publicly accessible in the way we did, was specifically to make sure it reached the largest audience, to provoke a conversation about privacy in a more nuanced way that it's been undertaken over the last few years, which has been much more polemic in its orientation. We all know this technology is not going away, but we know that if we don't take control of it, then it could lead to bad outcomes. So I would love to hear if anybody has any comments or questions.
Yep, you can just unmute yourself and speak to the group.
Come on, guys, don't be shy.
Don't be so private.
We have one.
Raise a hand.
Galdino?
Hi there. Yeah, I just curious if you managed to pinpoint. So like you talk about how much time we all would have to invest to understand all the private settings. We click OK. Did you get to a point of determining how much that would cost to get to that point? Let's say how much money like is being put into just understanding what we are clicking OK to, and like considering how society has organized itself in other situations, like should we have some sort of certifying agency or of sorts to look at that?
Good question. So we didn't, although I'm kind of now I really want to. But there are, if you are looking for a lot of T's and C's that you sign, there will be a lawyer who has reviewed it and has published something about it in kind of layman's terms. So typically, if you actually Google that T's and C's, you'll get a synopsis with somebody saying, look, these are the risks. What I found is almost always the risks are like horrendous. So if you actually read them, the amount of data being and the freedom that they have to use that data is pernicious, it's problematic, and the length of time they'll store it for. GDPR has gone some way to trying to restrict that, but generally speaking, these T's and C's don't give you any rights as a user really, and allow these businesses to do whatever they want with your data. So you kind of read them and you think, I still want to use the product, so I'm going to do this anyway. I wish somebody would come along and change this or introduce legislation that didn't allow them to do this. But if the outcome is either I get to use this tool that I want to use or I don't get to use it, people are still choosing to use it. So there's no real advocate in most places for the end users here who don't have the capacity to oftentimes consume the information, understand it, but also don't have the capacity to do anything about it if they find it disagreeable, because there's no reasonable alternative. And this, the Facebook conversation this week, I think, is a really realistic one. There's quite obviously a monopoly there, because if somebody wants to use Facebook but are not happy with their T's and C's, they don't have a reasonable alternative for a lot of those propositions. There is no reasonable alternative to Facebook now, for instance. It's quite clearly a monopoly. So that is an interesting question. I would love to find out what it would cost, or even if there was a kind of a digital social enterprise initiative that was trying to catalog those T's and C's in a more effective way and to break down the most common transgressions they find within them.
Well, I would argue that one can vote with their feet, so to speak, and use alternative services. So I'm personally not a fan of Google search, for example. I switched away a while ago, and I'm trying to do the same with other Google services. And I think yesterday the number came up that it would cost the equivalent of, say, 50 to 100 euro per month to use non-Google services. Say, if there even is an alternative, say Maps, you don't really have one, but if you want to use Proton Mail or other sort of privacy-centered services, it would run you up, quite a bit of money. But I think that's a reasonable exchange, and I think a lot of people are opting for that, voting with their feet, getting rid of the Googles and the Facebooks and the Amazons to the best of their capacity.
I don't know if it's a counter, Michelle, but I think that you are obviously an atypical user in a lot of ways as well. You're more informed and more advanced than the typical person on the street. So for an awful lot of those people, I think if you stop somebody in the street, most of them have never heard of Proton Mail, would be, or even the Proton Cloud now as well. So the alternatives to Drive that are coming up. So it's kind of, there are, yes, examples of alternatives out there. I would say oftentimes the products are reasonably good. Like say for instance, the privacy phones. You've got smartphones out there that are privacy phones that are reasonably good, but they're still significantly behind the amount of utility you can access via one like an iPhone or any equivalent smartphone. And the problem therein as well is the associated apps that you can then use as well. You lose access to a lot of those. So if your privacy is important to you, yes, absolutely, there are alternatives out there for you. But I think as well, there's this battle for the middle ground where somebody can access a reasonably high level of utility and also have a reasonably high level of autonomy. Not like, and that's I think what's missing at the moment. There's this kind of polemic aspect to it, which is I can use just privacy tools, and I can always have my VPN on. I can use a privacy smartphone. I can get away from Google, get away from Facebook, get away from Amazon, etc. And I don't have a significant digital footprint as a result of all of that. But at the same time, you lose access to certain social capacities, certain tools that might be a competitive advantage as well. And I think that's really a part of the problem. But Michelle just posted a Google Alternatives link in the chat box.
It came up in my reading this morning. It was on Hacker News, so I couldn't ignore it. We have a comment and a question from Dion. So first mentioning the importance of nonlinear, multiple, and trans-contextual futures. So thanks for that. I think it's very on point with what we're trying to achieve. And also asking what are the major themes of the future of privacy that really stood out from our findings, and if they're equally valid from sort of in the South and the global North, given big tech's dominance.
Question.
I could answer that. Like, one of the things that really stood out for us, at least for me during our research piece, was that the future of privacy won't be anymore like about passwords and memorizing hundreds of passwords like we do now. Privacy will be different because these passwords will turn out to be our own bodies. So the use of digital fingerprints or even brain scans, scanning like your eyes, your palms, your veins. We have seen like so many biosensors in which people can be identified, not only like, and I'm not even talking about facial recognition or the way you walk and move. It's also a signature of yourself. So basically, the things we do now with passwords will be done with our own presence, let's say. So I think this gives a context on how the future of privacy will be. We will have to change our ways of walking, like John mentioned, our hairstyles or makeup, so we are not more recognizable anymore. So I think this is a thing that really stood out, because once the password is yourself, how can you hide it? How can you turn into go to a different way? And about if it's equally valid for global South and North, I guess due to big tech dominance, I think for sure, like we see, for example, in Europe, especially Germany, with a lot of other like mechanisms in order to safeguard privacies for the users, and we see in other countries that it doesn't happen at all. Also, where this big tech is really has its headquarters, it's where they are really accountable. We don't see them being accountable anywhere else yet. And for privacy, we really have more issues than solutions. That is also a take that I got from our research, because there's really not much thing we can do about it, because it's just so decentralized the way we have our privacy change. But I'm sure John, Michelle, and Nadya has other views as well.
I can jump in first. It's a really good question. I think on the kind of global North, global South question, I think regionally we're going to see massive distinctions. my own working hypothesis here is that it's very difficult to imagine democracy being successful in countries where there is, or in regions where there is significant privacy degradation. I think that the two things are linked. You know, your autonomy, your privacy is linked to your autonomy. Your autonomy is linked to your franchise. You diminish your privacy, you diminish autonomy. You diminish autonomy, you diminish the franchise, and then you end up having tools. And we have this in the narrative as well, where tools are guiding you towards electoral decisions, so who you should vote for based on your own personal context. This is the person who's best for you in the long term, financially, in one of them, by mining your data. And I think that's really problematic because that technology is owned by corporations. And that might seem kind of far-fetched at the moment, but I think if we break the world into large geographical regions, you know, quite clearly in China, privacy and autonomy have been rescinded quite significantly, but it is geopolitically contextual. Nadya can kind of talk more to that. She's more of an expert in China. I think in the US, we've seen massive degradation of individual autonomy, and Europe are trying to take a different route. And I'm optimistic about the route Europe are taking. The idea of building a Rails infrastructure for identity and data and capital, I think, is a really admirable one, and will be one that ultimately preserves democracy in Europe and serves individuals more effectively. I think that's a big one. In terms of themes, the epiphany that I had doing this, and it's not on the research side, but it was on the writing side, was that the consequences for people that choose autonomy is potentially isolation or ostracization. This is a theory that I have, again, but one I've become increasingly convinced of, is that for over time, and an example that I use in one of the streams is the idea that if you live in an estate with lots of houses in kind of a community setting, that there will be incentives for everybody in that community to subscribe to certain systems. For example, for insurance reasons, you've got cheaper insurance if everybody is subscribed to kind of a collaborative security infrastructure. Now, if you opt out of that security infrastructure because you think that it is, that from a data and privacy consideration, that is too invasive, you find yourself then in conflict with your neighbors because they have depended on you to access a certain product or a certain product at a certain price, and now you're holding them back from that. So you end up getting kind of forced out. And that's an example we use, but that example is usable over and over and over and over again. And the kind of the extreme impact of that is kind of a form of isolation. And that isolation then will construct other communities that are privacy-focused communities. I think that was a really big kind of epiphany for me, because it seems like it's already moving that way. You know, like Michelle's point a minute ago about alternatives to Google. And like I've tried it myself. I've tried to not use WhatsApp. I don't like using Facebook products. I've tried to get friends of mine to download Telegram or Signal over time, and they just haven't moved. And until the critical mass is there, those tools can sometimes be a little bit useless because you've got to maintain your presence on the other platforms. So yeah, that's the current challenge. But Nadya, I think maybe you have some thoughts on the China side. I don't know, but I think you've made the point to me numerous times before that we just can't readily compare China to the rest of the world. That it's just so different.
Yeah, I mean, on the question of social scoring, I guess there are two ways to think about it. If you look from a European perspective, where we are generally less willing to share our data, well, the first thing to realize about Chinese users is that that's not the top issue on their minds. But also to understand what is, without actually defending at all the social scoring system in China, because I think it's very problematic. There are actually some objective reasons why it was created. It's more actually the consequences of the decisions that were made that I think are problematic. The reason why that was created in China, from my understanding, is there was no level of no source of trust in the in the financial system. If you want to get credit in China, there was no way for any institution to decide what is your level of risk, because there was no data to base that on. So that was the kind of the original impetus for that. Now, obviously, the question that complicates things is what is the intentionality behind that further down the line. So on China, I think it's quite nuanced and very contextual, and it would be very difficult to compare the European approach with the Chinese approach because the starting point is very different. But another topic that I think is related to that, and I've been thinking about, and it's very heavily embedded in the narrative, is that question of data as property and the monetization of data. I mean, multiple times as you engage with Will will ask you whether you want to use your data as a source of passive income. And you have to make choices about this. And I think this debate about treating data as your property that you can monetize and profit from is something that is becoming a bigger and bigger discussion since we actually created Will. But it's obviously a very problematic point because on the one hand, on the face of it, right, it's empowering, right? Suddenly the asymmetry that exists between the user and the market, the corporates that use your data is removed. But then what about the other side of the topic, which is if you treat data as property or as a commodity, it incentivizes you to actually share it rather than protect yourself. And then if you actually add another layer to that, well, what happens if we look at the people with different socioeconomic situations? I think there's a reasonable assumption to be made that people of lower income status will actually be more incentivized to share their data. So then you're creating kind of this inequality in privacy based on the existing inequalities that we have. So we're exacerbating this. There's also the question of what is the balance between the personal value and the value of data as a public good. Is my data just my data, or can it be used for the public good? And that's also another tension which exists in that question. So I'm kind of curious to see what everybody thinks on that topic.
I saw Arthur in the comments. Is he going to join us for a second?
Hey.
So
Yeah, I'm setting him up as a co-host.
And we didn't even start talking about our genetic rights, because if our DNA and RNA can be decoded and can be used as a data source, even our own DNA can be a source of agreement to this practice. Just corroborating what John and Nadya just said, privacy is becoming more and more an economy. So we will probably see a lot of markets around that. As much as attention is an economy, because the more attention you have, the more you can sell stuff, let's say, and have more property about the things you're saying. So is privacy. And the more data they can get from us, we can share with big tech, the more power they can have over us as well.
It kind of connects to Kathy's point.
Please.
So it kind of connects a little bit to Kathy's point. Keep going. I'll explain what I mean in a moment.
No, please go on. I think
Kathy has made a comment in the comment box that says, you see data being stolen, sold, used beyond the user agreement daily. Should users assume and accept that data is public to the world for all good and bad purposes when they push the agree button? And I think sometimes it's worthwhile creating a division between login details and your data. Like login details being stolen, not good, easily fixable, and also sometimes easy to mitigate. Your data being stolen is more like an asset being stolen from your house. So in some ways, it's the difference between somebody stealing your house keys or your car keys and somebody stealing things in your house or somebody stealing your car. They're somewhat different. And I think that there's a degree to which we can accept that our login details being stolen is always a threat. But if we provide a company with kind of that, like a privilege of looking after our assets, because this idea that this data becomes an asset for us, then I think we should not accept that it's just going to be stolen or that it should be public. In fact, I think that we should absolutely demand that it's preserved like a financial asset would be. We would not be okay if a bank lost our money and said, I'm sorry, your money's been taken. Now, I know money and data are different types of assets, but simply put, I don't think we'd ever accept that. Now, if a bank told us, look, our logins have been compromised, we want you to change your details, and if we refuse to do it and then our money was stolen, okay, that's different. But I think that balance is important. We need to accept that our login credentials are always at risk, but our actual underlying data, we need to build infrastructure to protect and preserve that and give us more discretion over how it's used. Sorry, just addressing Kathy's point there, but I thought it was very linked, because especially as we see genetic data, and one of the big risks there is a new type of discrimination, like genetic discrimination. If we begin to identify genes that are deemed antisocial genes, So somebody who has this gene is more likely to be antisocial in some way. Do you begin to genetically isolate them or genetically sterilize them in some way? Or for, you know, there's so many new ways for discrimination to arise. And it's so reminiscent of the pseudoscience of the late 19th century and the early 20th century that justified so much of the racism at the time. That it's so familiar. I think we've been through this before, but now we're going to use tech to enable it.
If I may chime in for a second, I would love to comment on this point. I mentioned first about the bioidentification or biometrics in that sense. I think there's a line of development for our knowledge to what those technologies actually affect our lives in a way, because we've been quite accustomed to having our thumbs or fingerprints or our facial biometrics as a way of having access, not only identification. And I think this is a consequence that we should understand as users. And this is coming naturally with the way we're accustomed and we're facing the implications that these new technologies have. And I think the same thing should go with the data that we're making available as well. It's also quite a big struggle because as more connected we are, the more data we are unknowingly giving away as well. So I think what I really like about this project, about the future of privacy, is like to really provoke some more conscience in people regarding to what are they actually giving away. So I think just the point that I made regarding the biometrics or bioidentification is that we know right now, even with what we have for like your iPhone or like any other smartphones, that you're using your facial features to identify and to give access is very flawed, because there's a difference. And I think this is established that we should set that one thing is to identify yourself and the other is to give access. That's why, like, it's funny, like when you think about passwords, it's something that it's inside your mind or sometimes hidden away, but you're promptly putting that in. So you know of cases of like police officers like actually like facing or getting the thumb of someone to unlock their phones, or like even kids that they just grab or change the phone to the face of their parents so they can unlock it. That's a interesting like discussion that you should have about the effect or the possibilities of this technology. So I think these distinctions of what we're giving away and not, it's a very interesting thing if you know about the text.
For sure. Thank you, Arthur.
Great to hear from you, Arthur.
So we have about 2 more minutes. We're running this one tight because we're starting another session on the future of reality and consensus reality in a few minutes, which should also be exciting. Let's deconstruct that, and I'll share the link in the chat. But any parting thoughts?
I mean, Gio's comment here, everybody is hackable. You know, I think what we need to begin questioning is, if we think about it in a bank again, people don't hack our individual bank accounts because it's not worth the effort, typically, even though it's very, very possible to do so. But on an individual level, what's the point in hacking one person? They hack the bank. And when we create these massive pools of data within these companies, we create targets, and all of these targets are vulnerable. All of these companies have been hacked. Like there is none of these massive companies that haven't been hacked. So I think there is maybe an initiative that we need to create which allows us to own our own data and store our own data and you know, make it an individual thing. So if we're attacked individually rather than as a group. I think that's increasingly going to be something that we need to look at.
Hi, thank you for showcasing this work. Honestly, it was quite mesmerizing. I was quite in awe of what you guys created. And when I was going through it too, I think I might not be the normal consumer. I was very, very pessimistic about sharing my information, trying the new apps and things like that. And I think the point that you made about comparing data to money, I think is quite interesting. In some ways, I think some of us do compare it and equalize each other, but I think there's still a majority of people who don't consider data as valuable as money. I mean, money is kind of inherently, it's an interesting product of society where people have put inherent value into it. But I think data is also quite interesting in a different way in which our individual data isn't as useful as the collective data. So I think when it comes to people sharing information when they're using the website, going on Google, whether or not it's downloading a new app, they don't really consider it the same way as giving away money. So I think that's a huge, I think, social cultural thing that people don't really understand yet in terms of how their individual data is actually valuable to that company and to society.
Sure.
John, you're on mute.
I was just voicing my agreement. Apologies, I'm on mute because of the background noise. But yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right that but the problem with data is it's a complex asset. You know, the issue is if I was to sell you my data, you could buy it from me, but you still have a fiduciary responsibility to me to treat it in a certain way because it still impacts me. Unlike a different asset, that makes it really complex, and there's different types of data as well. So, but it's going to take some time for people to begin to realize that it's a valuable asset to them. Probably the rich before it's the poor, maybe as well. So that would be problematic.
Do you think we'll get to that point, to the point where like privacy and the policies around it will actually catch up with technology and protecting people before technology gets to a point where it kind of runs away from us and how they utilize our data?
Only if the policy it starts being generated by machine. I think at that point that might stimulate some effective policy when it comes to data. But I do like the way the EU is approaching this as a general direction. Execution is a different thing, but generally I think trying to put the data within the realm responsibility of the individual citizen, I think, is a much more effective way of maintaining the system long term, and creating a secondary market for data that's controlled by the individual rather than controlled by corporates. So like a wholesale data market where people are buying and selling large groups of tranche securitized individual data. Depressing.
We could go on, I guess, forever on this topic.
Work.
There's just so
yeah,
nice
we gotta
to wrap
go.
Up. Yes.
See you guys.
Thank
you so much.
See you.
Yeah, we have to wrap
Thanks,
this
everybody.
up. We have another one starting in a few minutes.
Good
See
luck
you at
with
the
the next
summit.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
Bye bye.
Lovely
Ciao.
conversation.
Obrigada.